I remember the exact afternoon I lost everything. Not the money that had been gone for months by then. Not the house on Fifth Avenue Father had already signed that away to men in dark coats who smelled like cigar smoke and impatience. No. I lost everything the afternoon I stood in Mrs. Calloway's parlor and heard through a door left carelessly open that my fiance, the man who had knelt before me with a ring that caught the chandelier light, like a trapped star, had married Eleanor Briggs in a quiet ceremony in Boston. 3 weeks before our wedding, I remember the sound of my own breathing in that parlor. Just breathing, like that was the only thing left I knew how to do. My name is Louisa Vandermeer, or it was, when that name still meant something in New York society, when Father was still the kind of man who made promises from the head of a mahogany dining table. I will protect this family. I will provide. I will never let you want for anything. And you believed him because his voice was so steady, so sure. He had this way of looking right at you when he spoke, like the words were being carved into stone. They were carved into sand. The gambling took everything. Not quickly, that would have been merciful. Slowly, one promise at a time, dissolving like sugar in hot water. The summer house first, then Mother's jewelry, then the household staff, one by one, until it was just the three of us in a house too big for people who could no longer look at each other. Mother stopped speaking somewhere around September. Not angry silence, something worse. The silence of a woman who had simply run out of reasons to open her mouth. She sat in the parlor with her hands folded and her eyes fixed on some middle distance where, I suppose, the promises still held. Father died in November of 1885. The last weeks, he would not eat, would not read, would not sit in any room where Mother's empty jewelry case was visible. He turned his face to the wall, the way a man turns from a mirror he can no longer bear. And the pneumonia found him like that, already surrendered, already gone in every way that mattered. And then came February. And then came the advertisement. I found it in the Oregon Territorial Register, a newspaper I had no business reading, in a boarding house I had no business living in. 3 lines. That was all. 3 lines from a man named Amos Tucker. In the high desert country of eastern Oregon. I ain't rich. I ain't handsome. But I keep my word. I read it 4 times. Not because it was beautiful, honestly. It was the plainest thing I had ever read. No flourish. No poetry. No attempt to dress itself in borrowed finery. And I thought, this is either the most honest man in America or the most cunning, because only a fool or a truth-teller advertises his own poverty. I answered the notice that same evening. My hand was steady. My expectations were not. The train west took 4 days. I watched the landscape strip itself bare outside the window, the cities giving way to farmland, giving way to something vast and brown and honest in its emptiness. No pretense out there, no marble facades hiding rotting foundations. Just land, just sky, just the raw truth of what a place is when it stops trying to impress you. I pressed my forehead to the cold glass and thought, well, Louisa, at least the land makes no promises it cannot keep. That was the only comfort I carried into Oregon. He was standing at the station platform at noon. I know it was noon because I checked. I checked the way a woman checks the lock on her door twice before sleeping, not because she believes it will hold, but because the checking itself is all she has left. Noon? He said noon. It was noon. Amos Tucker was smaller than I had imagined, not short exactly, but compact, like a man who had been pared down to only the necessary parts. Brown hair going gray at the temples, hands that looked like they had been arguing with the earth for 30 years and had come to some kind of rough truce. He held his hat in both hands, and he did not smile, not because he was unkind. I would learn, but because he did not smile at things that were not yet certain. Mrs. Vandermeer. Miss, I corrected. Miss Vandermeer. Yes'm. I got the cart just over here. No flowers, no rehearsed speech, no performance of welcome. Just a mule cart and a dirt road and a man who walked slightly ahead to check the mud before I stepped in it. The ranch was, well, I had been raised among marble columns and crystal chandeliers and silk wallpaper imported from Paris. So when I say the ranch was modest, you must understand I am being generous. A cabin with a porch that leaned west like it was tired and had simply decided to rest. A barn that tilted slightly east, as though the cabin and the barn were slowly falling away from each other. Fences that held, but only through what I can only describe as stubbornness. I catalogued every shortcoming with the trained eye of a woman raised among finer things. The cracked step, the water stain on the ceiling, the door that stuck. But then he carried my trunk inside without asking permission, showed me the bedroom small, scrubbed clean, the quilt folded with military precision. I'll be sleeping in the barn, he said. Ain't no trouble. Done it before. No martyrdom in his voice. No hidden negotiation. Just fact. And there went on the windowsill wildflowers, purple and yellow, stuffed into a tin cup that had been polished until it almost shone. A small gesture, the kind a man makes when he does not know how to make a large one. I distrusted it immediately, distrusted the way it made something tighten behind my ribs. I closed the bedroom door that night and stood very still, listening to his boots cross the yard toward the barn. Measured steps, unhurried, exactly the distance he had promised. The first week, I kept count. I don't know why. Some habit of the ruined. I suppose this need to track what is owed, what is delivered, what falls short. My father had taught me, without meaning to, that every promise carries a debt, and every debt eventually defaults. So I watched, and I counted. Monday, Amos said he would have firewood cut before dawn. I woke to the sound of the axe at 5:30, stacked and ready by the time I had dressed. Tuesday, he said he would fix the window, the one in the bedroom that let a thin blade of February air across my pillow. By evening, it was sealed, no draft, no ceremony, Wednesday supper at 6, plain beans, bread, coffee strong enough to, well, strong enough to float a horseshoe, as they say out here, but warm, and at 6, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I kept the ledger in my head the way I had once kept Father's household accounts, back when there were still accounts to keep, each promise a line item, each delivery confirmed, not a single deficit. I offered to help with his finances, not out of kindness. I told myself, out of dinas yar intolerance for disorder. A woman raised in society learns bookkeeping the way she learns embroidery, as armor disguised as decoration. What I found stunned me. Amos Tucker had no ledger, no formal accounts, just honest estimates and handshake agreements with neighboring ranchers. He bought what he could afford. He owed no man. No man owed him. It was the simplest financial arrangement I had ever encountered, and it worked perfectly because every word behind it was sound. You could expand, I told him one evening, surprising myself. With proper accounts, proper planning, you could run twice the herd. He looked at me over his coffee. I reckon I could, he said, but I won't promise what I can't deliver. Evenings were quiet, not the loaded silence of my father's house, where quiet meant someone was hiding something. This was different. This was two people sharing a cabin, the way two strangers share a train car, cautiously, politely, neither filling the space with words that might not hold weight. I wrote in my journal that Sunday night, 7 days, 7 words kept, and underneath, in smaller letters, a question that made my pen stop and my breath catch, and my hand hover over the page for a long, long time before I set it down and closed the book without finishing. The question was about fear and reliability and why the two had become the same thing inside me. I did not sleep well that night. I began watching his hands, not intentionally, God, not intentionally, but a woman who has spent her life reading the performances of men. Well, she learns to watch what hands do when mouths are closed. My father's hands had been elegant, expressive, always gesturing towards some grand future that never arrived. My fiance's hands had been soft, always reaching for mine in public, always absent in private. Amos's hands were, they were just hands, brown, scarred across the knuckles, calloused in patterns that told the story of 30 years of fence posts and harness leather and frozen mornings. He mended a bridle one evening by the fire, and I watched his fingers work the leather with a patience that made something ache behind my sternum. No flourish, no awareness that he was being observed, just a man repairing what was broken because that was what needed doing. He helped the Dawson family rebuild a collapsed fence that week, rode over at first light, came back after dark, said nothing about it. I only knew because Mrs. Dawson mentioned it at the general store, mentioned it the way you mention weather, like it was simply what happened. My father once donated $500 to a children's hospital and made sure the New York Herald printed his name in the society column. Amos Tucker rebuilt a neighbor's fence and came home smelling like sweat and cedar and did not even mention it over supper. Which one was the generous man? I was beginning to know the answer. And it unsettled me. Then came the dust storm. It rolled in from the east on a Thursday, a wall of brown that swallowed the horizon like something biblical. Amos got the animals into the barn, sealed the cabin windows with rags, and we settled in. 2 days. 2 days sealed inside that cabin with a man I was still pretending I did not trust. I read aloud to fill the silence. Shakespeare, The Tempest, because I had a dark sense of humor even then. Amos listened. He did not pretend to understand every word, did not nod along like a man performing attention. He just listened. And when Prospero spoke of mercy, Amos said, quietly, I like that part. The mercy part. Would you like me to read it again? I asked. Yes'm, if you don't mind. So I read it again. And the second time, I watched his face instead of the page, and I saw something I had never seen on a man's face while listening to Shakespeare, not admiration for the language, not intellectual performance, but simple recognition. Like Prospero's mercy was something Amos Tucker already practiced and had just never heard a name for. The storm passed on Saturday morning. The dust settled. The sky afterward was so clean it almost hurt this enormous blue, scrubbed raw. like the world itself had been stripped down to only what was true. And I realized, standing at that mended window, looking out at that scoured sky, I had not heard a lie in 2 weeks. The recognition did not comfort me. It terrified me. The window, that damned window, it became my obsession, and I knew it was foolish. I knew it. A mended window is just glass and putty, and a man with a steady hand. And I was a grown woman standing before it like it was a cathedral. But the light, the way the February light came through after he fixed it, clean, unobstructed, falling across the floorboards in a square of pale gold that moved with the hours like a sundial. Before he fixed it, the cold came through, a thin, constant whisper of winter that I had accepted the way I accepted all discomfort as inevitable, as the cost of living. And then one Tuesday, he sealed it, and the cold simply stopped, and warmth stayed where it was supposed to stay. I am not a fool. I knew the metaphor was too obvious. I resented it, honestly. I resented my own heart for reaching towards symbolism like a vine towards sunlight. But then the small betrayals of myself began accumulating. I caught myself saving a plate warm for Amos when he worked late. Caught myself listening for his boots on the porch, the way you listen for a train you are not sure is coming. Caught myself pouring 2 cups of coffee in the morning without being asked. Setting his on the left side of the table where he always sat. Small domesticities, tiny surrenders. Each one a crack in the armor I had so carefully constructed in New York parlors and boarding house rooms. I argued with myself constantly. This is gratitude, Louisa, proximity, practical arrangement. A woman does not rebuild her heart on firewood deliveries and mended windows. A woman who has been ruined by eloquent men does not fall for a man whose longest sentence is storms comin', best bring in the wash. And then the evening I broke. I don't even know what caused it. There was no trigger, no memory, no letter from the past arriving to undo me. I was simply standing at the stove, stirring beans, and the tears came not from sadness, but from something deeper. Exhaustion. Years and years of bracing for impact. My whole body had been clenched like a fist since I was 19 years old, and suddenly, without permission, the fist opened. I stood there crying into the beans and hating myself for it. Amos came in from the barn, saw me, and listen, this is the part I need you to understand. He did not ask me why. He did not rush to me. He did not try to fix it. He poured a cup of coffee, set it on the table beside me, and sat down across the room. Gave me space, gave me silence, gave me the one thing no man in my life had ever given me permission to feel without performing. I don't know how long I cried. I know when I stopped. The coffee was still warm. He was still there. Much obliged, I whispered. He nodded. Yes'm. That night, lying in the dark, I felt something shift. Not a door opening, nothing so dramatic. More like a single stone falling from a wall I had built so carefully. I heard it land somewhere deep inside me. Just one stone. But the wall was not the same after. Harlan Cobb arrived on a Tuesday with a smile that reminded me of my father. I recognized it instantly, that particular warmth that is not warmth at all, but calculation wearing a pleasant face. He rode up on a tall bay horse, hat tilted at what he clearly believed was a charming angle, and introduced himself as our neighbor to the north, owner of a spread 3 times the size of Amos's, with water rights and cattle enough to make any man in the territory tip his hat. Just being neighborly, he said, leaning against our fence. Wanted to welcome the new Mrs. Tucker. Miss Vandermeer, I corrected, and I appreciate the welcome. Mr. Cobb. His eyes moved over the cabin the way mine had that first day, finding every flaw. But where I had looked with disappointment, he looked with purpose. Fine woman like you, he said, ought to have a place that don't lean. I smiled the smile I had learned in New York ballrooms, the one that shows teeth without showing anything at all. The leaning suits me just fine. But the damage was not Cobb's visit. It was what followed. Town women began to whisper. The mismatch, they called it. The society bride and the dirt rancher. I heard fragments at the general store, poor thing, and what was she thinking, and must have been desperate. A letter arrived from New York Margaret Ashton, a woman I had once called a friend, informing me that my situation was the subject of great amusement in certain parlors. I read it once and set it in the stove without reading it again. Old weather from an old country. It meant nothing out here, but then Cobb diverted the creek. It was subtle, a series of earthen berms on his upper property that redirected the shared water away from Amos's grazing land. Legal, probably, neighborly. Not by a long measure. Amos's small herd, 20 head of cattle, each one named, each one representing a year of honest work, began nosing at dry troughs by midweek. I expected rage. I expected scheming. I expected the familiar machinery of men and their ambitions grinding to life. Amos rose the next morning at 4. I heard him through the wall boots, coat, the careful creak of the door closing behind him. I went to the window, the mended window, and in the gray light before dawn, I watched him walk to the creek bed with 2 buckets, kneel in the frozen mud, fill them from the trickle that still came through. He straightened slowly, the weight pulling at his shoulders, his breath clouding white in the cold, and carried them back to the trough, set them down, turned back, walked the same path again, knelt again, filled again, carried again. I counted 7 trips before the sun cleared the ridge. 7 trips through mud that sucked at his boots, with water that sloshed cold over his wrists, in air that turned his knuckles red and raw. He did not look toward the cabin, did not check whether anyone was watching, did not stop to curse Cobb's name or shake his fist at the berms upstream. He simply carried water, the way he did everything without announcement, without performance, without once asking the world to notice that he was keeping his animals alive through nothing but his own 2 hands, and his refusal to let a kept promise die of thirst. I stood at that window until my coffee went cold, until the sun turned the frost to shine on the fence posts I had once thought inadequate, and I felt something rise in my chest that I could not, I honestly could not call gratitude anymore. Gratitude is what you feel for a stranger's kindness. This was something older, something that had roots. I did not have a name for it yet, but my hands were shaking when I set down the cup. Midnight, the cabin dark, the train schedule in my hand. I had kept it tucked between the pages of The Tempest like a bookmark to another life. Portland to San Francisco. San Francisco to anywhere. The paper was soft from handling. From the weeks I had carried it as insurance against the moment Amos Tucker inevitably revealed himself to be just another man who could not hold his word. I sat on the edge of the bed he had given me, the bed he slept in for years before I arrived. The bed he surrendered without negotiation, and I argued with myself in the dark. My father was charming before he was ruinous. My fiance was devoted before he was gone. What if consistency is simply a slower form of the same deception? What if the quiet ones just take longer to disappoint? What if Amos Tucker what if he was building my trust, the way a card player builds a pot? Patiently, methodically, waiting for the moment when the stakes are high enough to take everything. I stood up. My hands moved to the trunk. Latch cold brass in a dark room. I pressed my thumb against it and held it there, feeling the metal warm slowly under my skin. And I thought about packing, thought about the morning train, thought about arriving somewhere new, where I would not have to decide anything, where I could simply be a woman in transit, belonging to no place, risking nothing. From the barn, through the thin cabin walls, I heard Amos cough once in his sleep, a small sound, human, unguarded, the sound of a man who did not know he was being listened to, who was not performing even in his dreams. My thumb stayed on the latch, but my hand did not open it. Every instinct built by betrayal, every lesson taught by elegant men in expensive rooms, screamed the same word: leave. Leave before the keeping stops. Leave before the window breaks again. Leave before you are standing in another empty parlor listening to your own breathing, because a man's word turned out to be nothing but air. But then someone, the other voice, smaller, quieter, the voice that had been keeping its own ledger these past weeks, the one that noticed the noon arrival, the firewood at dawn, the coffee set down without questions, the space given without being asked, the 7 trips through frozen mud with water buckets while the sky was still dark. That voice did not argue. It simply asked one question. Has he broken a single word yet? The silence in that cabin was honestly, it was the loudest thing I had ever heard, because the answer was no, not one word, not one promise, not one small truth failed to arrive exactly as stated. I set the train schedule on the nightstand. I lay back down. I did not unpack the doubt, but I did not pack the trunk either. I lay in the dark with my heart hammering against the terrifying weight of almost choosing. And outside, in the barn, Amos Tucker slept the sleep of a man who had no idea that a woman was deciding his fate by the sound of his breathing. Valentine's Day arrived without announcement. No decorations, no imported chocolates in velvet boxes, no engraved invitations to masked balls where men whispered promises they would abandon by March. Just a February morning in eastern Oregon, frost on the ground, smoke from the chimney, the sound of Amos splitting wood in the early light. I poured 2 cups of coffee and carried one to the porch. He set down the axe and took it. Steam rose between us like a question neither of us had asked aloud. Amos, yes'm, it is. It's Valentine's Day. He looked out over the frosted pasture. I reckon it is. In New York, I said, and I could hear the careful architecture of my own voice, still guarding, still measuring. Men would send roses, write sonnets, hire carriages draped in silk, grand gestures. The grander the better. He sipped his coffee. That's so. You have never, you don't make grand gestures. He was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that would have terrified me a month ago. Silence where I would have searched for the lie hiding underneath. But I had learned Amos's silences by now. They were not evasions. They were a man gathering his words the way he gathered firewood carefully. Only what was needed. Nothing wasted. Grand gestures, he said finally, are for folks who can't be trusted with small ones. I did not move. I stood on that porch with my coffee cooling in my hands, and I let the sentence settle into me the way February light settles through clean glass, slowly, completely. illuminating things I had kept in shadow for years. 10 words, plain as fence posts, and every chandelier promise I had ever received, every velvet declaration. Every silk-draped lie came apart like wet paper in the rain. I set my coffee on the railing. "I need to show you something," I said. "Will you come inside?" He followed without asking why. That was Amos. He did not need to know the reason before he trusted the request. I sat at the table and pulled out the papers I had been working on for 2 weeks, late at night, by lamplight, while Amos slept in the barn. A plan. A detailed, careful, thorough plan, drawn from every skill my Eastern education had given me. Water access. I had studied the creek patterns, walked the eastern boundary myself, identified a secondary spring that could be channeled to the ranch without touching Cobb's diversion. Legal and clean and ours. Trade agreements I had written to the mercantile in town, proposing a direct supply arrangement that would cut out the middleman Amos had been losing money to for years. Breeding strategy based on the livestock journals I had found in the general store. A plan to improve the herd through selective pairing over 3 seasons. I spread the papers on the table, my handwriting neat, precise, the penmanship of a woman raised to write thank you notes on ivory cardstock, covering page after page of practical frontier strategy. Amos sat down. He read slowly. He was not a fast reader, and he did not pretend to be. His finger moved along the lines the way a man walks a fence, checking every post. He went back to the water map twice, studied the breeding notes, looked at the trade figures. "You figured all this?" he said. Not a question. A recognition. "I did." He was quiet again. But this quiet was different. This was the quiet of a man recalculating. The way you recalculate a field's acreage when you discover it is larger than you thought. "I am staying," I said. "Not because I have nowhere else to go. I have a train schedule in my nightstand and enough sense to use it. I am staying because I have spent my entire life surrounded by men who made grand promises and could not be trusted with small ones. And you are the first man I have ever met who understood that the small ones are all that matter." I pushed the papers toward him. "This is not charity. This is not gratitude. This is partnership. My education, your land, our labor. I am not shrinking into your world. Amos, I am asking to help build it wider." He looked at the plan, then at me. Those steady eyes, God, those eyes that never promised what they could not deliver. "I'll start on the water access tomorrow," he said. And I knew with the absolute certainty of a woman who had finally learned to read the difference between a promise and a kept word that tomorrow he would. Spring came, the way honesty comes slowly, without announcement, and then all at once, the secondary spring I had mapped flowed clean and steady once we channeled it enough for the herd, enough for the garden I planted along the south side of the cabin. Beans, carrots, herbs, nothing ornamental, everything useful. I had learned that from Amos without him ever teaching it. Beauty and purpose are not separate things. A fence that holds is beautiful. A window that keeps the cold out is beautiful. A word that arrives exactly when promised, that is the most beautiful thing I have ever known. The snowmelt helped too. When it came swelling, the creek passed Cobb's little berms of spite, as if the land itself had grown tired of pettiness. But it was the spring channel that saved us. My channel, the one I walked the boundary to find, the one I drew on paper by lamplight, the one Amos dug with his own hands because I showed him where to dig. Our solution. Not luck, not nature's mercy. Ours. The trade agreement with the mercantile saved us 11% on supplies. I know because I kept the ledger, now proper columns, proper accounting. Amos signed beside my name, Tucker and Vandermeer. I told him it should be Tucker and Tucker, since this was his land. He said, "You brung the plan. Your name stays." I did not argue. I was learning that some gifts are best accepted whole. The herd grew. 20 head became 26 by April. The calves came healthy, and the fences held, and every single morning, I woke to the sound of the axe at 5:30. Firewood cut, promise kept. The rhythm of it had become the rhythm of my own heartbeat. So steady, I no longer noticed it, except in the rare, precious moments when I stopped to listen. I wrote a letter to Margaret Ashton in New York. Not a defense, not a triumph. Just 5 words: I am building something real. I set down the pen and looked at my hands. They were not the hands I had brought from New York, soft, white, trained for piano keys and calling cards. These hands had calluses now, garden dirt under the nails, a small scar across the left thumb from a fencing mishap in March. They were hands that had done things, useful things, things that held soul. This morning I stood at the window he fixed that February Tuesday, the window that lets clean light fall across the floorboards, like a promise made visible, and I watched Amos cross the yard in early light. He carried the water buckets to the new channel, checking the flow the way he checks everything carefully, thoroughly, without hurry. He walked the way he always walks, steady, unhurried, arriving exactly when he means to arrive. He looked up, saw me in the window, did not wave. Amos is not a waving man. He simply nodded. One small gesture from a man who has always understood that small gestures, kept faithfully, are the grandest things in this world. I nodded back. And I thought, standing in the home I chose, looking through the glass he mended, holding the life we are building with my educated hands and his honest ones, I thought I once measured love by the size of the promise. Now I measure it by whether the wood is cut by morning. It is always cut by morning. That is what grand looks like when it is real.